Alright, so for this week's episode in the mule deer diet series that I'm doing, I'm going to be covering the Sandhills of central Nebraska. This is actually an area that I have a good amount of hunting experience in firsthand, so I have a good amount of insight into this area in addition to the sources that I'm going to be pulling on mule deer diets here. So again, a little bit of background on this region. The Sandhills of central Nebraska makes up most of that center portion of the state, outside of what we would call the panhandle, and then the more eastern woodland and farmland areas. So most of the central portion of Nebraska is going to be these sandhills. Hunting units that are going to fall into this area are going to be the Plains unit on the west side, Calamus West, going to be the east side of the sandhills, and then most of the sandhills unit, or at least that main central portion of the sandhills itself, is going to be the sandhills hunting unit. Towns such as Valentine and Thedford are the bigger towns in the region. It's not a very high population region. These towns are usually around 100 to 2,000 people, somewhere in that range. But I'm going to do a little bit of a breakdown on the deer population in this series too from now on. So the deer population in this area is down from the highs from a few years ago, and it's been kind of declining steadily. It's not at all-time lows, but the harvest for this past year across most of Nebraska was actually the lowest harvest since, I think, the 1980s. So the harvest overall in Nebraska is declining, and the Sandhills region is no exception. Boone and Crockett data for this area, these three counties that I selected are the main three counties that people would hunt, at least for public land in the region. Cherry County in particular is a huge county. It's the biggest county in Nebraska, and they have the most Boone and Crockett mule deer in that area with 6. And then Garden County 2, and Thomas County is also 2. That compares to the best county in a state like Nevada, Lincoln County, that has 28 typical Boone and Crockett mule deer. And then Eagle County, Colorado, the best county in Colorado, has 85 Boone and Crockett mule deer. So the plant community of the Sandhills is going to be dominated by grass species. You're going to have species of grama, so like blue grama, hairy grama, and then you're going to have a lot of the blue stem species. In particular, you're going to have sand blue stem and little blue stem. Little blue stem and sand blue stem are most of the plants that you see out here. This is definitely a grassland ecosystem. In addition to that, though, there's going to be shrub species, especially on steeper areas and more moist areas and riparian areas, and areas that don't burn or get a lot of disturbance. There's a lot of fire suppression in the Sandhills now, so not a lot of it burns. But you're going to see things like chokecherry, and in particular rose is going to show up here, and that's actually a significant portion of mule deer diet, especially throughout the winter period. It's just such an easy species to identify that I'm not going to cover it in detail today, because you just have to identify all the numerous dense thorns on its stem, and then you really know you have a rose. Another significant species of plant out here is going to be the soapweed yucca, and during the summer months where it has those large fruits going up on the sides of the stem, mule deer will actually browse heavily on that, and they will use it as a portion of their diet into the winter months, although it becomes less significant during that time. But overall, this is going to have a lot of forbs in this grassland, and there are going to be some shrubs. The first plant that I'm going to talk about today is noted to be the most significant component of the mule deer diet in the fall and winter period, at least by the study that I found, which it's an older study. It's pretty old. It's from the 1950s. But it was the original study on the hunt that was conducted on the Bessie Ranger District of the Nebraska National Forest, which is really just sandhills. And so there's a lot of interesting data in this, such as what rifles people were hunting, and then they did the mule deer size, sex ratio. So it's a pretty in-depth study, but they also do the dietary composition portion of the study. And this plant, western snowberry, is the most significant portion of their diet. If you go on USDA plants database, it's rated as a high palatability browse item for those browsing species like mule deer, and it falls within the honeysuckle family of plants. The interesting thing about western snowberry is going to be that it's rhizomatous, meaning that it has an extensive root structure underneath the soil, and it'll sprout from those roots. So that's what makes it actually a relatively fire-resistant species. If you have just a fire that sweeps across a grassland and doesn't really get drive a lot of heat into the soil, then the western snowberry has a good chance of surviving and repropagating from those roots. Gets to about 3 feet tall with the roughly 2-inch leaves. There's no serrations on these leaves, and that's what's going to set it apart from a lot of the other plants The edges of the leaves are smooth. They're relatively round, although they get some weird lobing on some of them. And you can kind of see that in the graphic where that's not quite serrations, but there are lobes and they're not completely circular or even an oval at that point. So for the most part, you're going to have a pretty standard looking leaf. Veins are apparent, but they're not that deep, and the notable thing is going to be the lack of serrations really on these leaves. The next plant that I'm going to talk about today is not one that I've noticed in the Sandhills, at least not noticed them utilizing, but I hunt it during the winter in the muzzleloader season, so it could be just that I'm not noticing it in association with these other plants because the leaves have dropped. But this is something called Prairie redroot, and its palatability for browsing animals is only rated as medium through the USDA plants database, but in the Sandhills, in a grassland ecosystem over the winter time where there's not a whole lot of browse species to choose from, it's potentially the best option for them to browse on. And they'll actually be browsing on, in the case of snowberry and prairie redroot, a lot of the stem component and that newer growth on the ends of the stems as opposed to leaves because the leaves have dropped already. But this is going to be within the buckthorn family of plants, and it's a fairly standard sized shrub, about 3 feet tall with 1 3/4 inch leaves. This is going to have a more oval shaped leaf than the snowberry, and there are going to be decent sized serrations that are forward facing on these leaves, and additionally the veins on these leaves are pretty apparent and pretty deep veins. So look for the serrations, look for the very oval shaped leaves, and then the deep veins on the leaves of this plant. The last one I'm going to talk about today is the chokecherry. This is one that I see really commonly being used by mule deer in the Sandhills. You'll find areas that have been browsed heavily by mule deer, especially during the winter time where they're browsing the ends of the twigs that have the newer, more palatable growth. But chokecherries can actually get pretty big, up to 25 feet tall and have 3.5 inch leaves. Most of them I see in the Sandhills are probably around the 7 foot tall range. There's also going to be a lot of a similar genus sand plum mixed throughout the Sandhills too. But I'm going to be talking about chokecherry today because it's found frequently throughout most of the Sandhills. So it's also rated by the USDA plants database as having a high palatability for the browsing animals. And it's, interestingly enough, for a relatively mid-sized tree or a very large shrub, it falls within the rose family as well. The main way you're going to be able to tell this apart from everything else is it's going to be the largest tree in the Sandhills that's not a cedar, or largest shrub. It's going to be the 8 foot tall shrub type thing in a lot of the basins and the bowls in the sand dunes on top. So it's pretty much going to be the largest thing out there. If you catch it during the growing season, the leaves are pretty apparent. They've got pretty decent sized serrations that are all forward facing on the leaves. And if you can catch it with the flowers, it has these very apparent white flowers that you see there as well. So that's going to wrap it up for the main browse species that you're going to find within the Sandhills. If you hunt this in the archery season, in that the early period of the year where there's still a lot of forbs and grass is more palatable, you'll find them using forb species as well. But by the time November rolls around into the rifle seasons, you're going to see them probably using a lot more of these browse species because the forbs and the grass have all desiccated and they're less palatable later on in that growing season. So if you hunt this in rifle and muzzleloader, these three are probably going to be your main species that mule deer are using. And in areas where I see a lot of snowberries, I tend to see more dense populations and higher populations of mule deer in the Sandhills utilizing those areas, at least from my own personal experience. So they do seem to be, like this study said, the mule deer in the Nebraska National Forest using the snowberries very heavily. If you can access that study, I recommend it. It's really interesting. It has a lot of interesting hunting history on Nebraska because the Nebraska National Forest in the Sandhills was the first area to reopen mule deer hunting after it got shut down when mule deer and deer populations in general just were all-time low in the 20s and 30s. So this Nebraska National Forest area was the first area to reinstate hunting of mule deer in the state. And then I also pulled information from the book Ecology and Management of Blacktail and Mule Deer of North America. They just had generic information on these are browse species that they'll utilize in the Great Plains, and then had a blurb on they will also use these forb species in the Sandhills because browse species can be relatively sparse and hard to find in these prairie ecosystems. So that's just going to about do it for today. But next week I'm going to pick a different area that I haven't hunted yet that's maybe more people hunt, and I'm thinking Could be New Mexico, one of the more popular areas there, or something like Idaho and Wyoming, areas there that people hunt a lot more. But stay tuned for that, and thanks for tuning in.